She approached the security checkpoint the same way she approached everything in life, with clarity, calm, and complete awareness of the space she occupied. But the moment she stepped forward, the energy shifted. You could feel it. Deputy Gerald Pike straightened up. His eyes narrowed, his stance widened, his hand rested just a little too intentionally on his belt. He didn't know her name. He didn't ask. He didn't care. What he saw was a black woman, standing tall, walking like she belonged, and that alone was enough to put him on edge. "Ma'am," he said, voice dipped in condescension, "I'm going to need you to step aside." She looked him in the eye and asked calmly, "Is there a problem?" But he didn't answer, not directly. His gaze moved over her like she was an equation that didn't add up. A black woman, alone, confident, polished, no badge on display, and still walking like she owned the room. In his mind, that didn't compute. He didn't wait for her response. He didn't even really pretend to have a reason. He muttered something about a missing ID, about building security, about procedures she supposedly violated just by existing in that space the way she did. She reached into her blazer and pulled out her credentials. Federal, official, sealed with the authority she had rightfully earned. But Pike didn't even read them. He glanced, dismissed it, then slid the badge into his pocket like it belonged to him. "You in a rush, sweetheart?" The word clung to the air like a slap. Another guard, young, uncertain, watched from behind the scanner, but said nothing. That silence was louder than any words. Celeste squared her shoulders. "I need to get to a courtroom," she said. He smirked. "Then you'll follow my procedure." Before she could ask what that meant, he grabbed her arm, not roughly enough to bruise, but firmly enough to dominate. Not enough for a report, just enough for a memory. He led her away from the checkpoint, down a quiet hallway, into a door marked secondary screening. The room was small, sterile. No windows, no witnesses, just walls thick enough to swallow sound and the sharp scent of cold metal in the air. A steel chair sat in the middle, surrounded by equipment. On a nearby tray, a pair of electric clippers rested in plain sight, unplugged but ready. Her pulse quickened. "I don't consent to this," she said, steady. "You have no legal cause to detain me." Pike tilted his head, mock curiosity in his voice. "Acting suspicious is cause enough." She didn't sit. Not right away. She wasn't afraid, but she wasn't naive either. Two more officers entered, one of them younger, eyes darting, clearly uncomfortable. The other, older, solid, silent. They flanked the chair. Pike's tone sharpened. "Sit down." She didn't, so he stepped in, closer, invading space that wasn't his. "You think that badge means something?" "Not here, not to me." And in one motion, the younger officer reached for her wrist, the other gripped her shoulder. She resisted, only slightly, just enough to make it clear this wasn't consent. And still, they forced her down. Her voice rose, not in panic, but in fury held tight behind her teeth. "I want your names," she said. No one answered. Pike picked up the clippers. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Standard procedure," he said flatly, plugging in the device. "You could be hiding something in that mop." The clippers buzzed to life, loud and sharp. She tried to move, but the hands pressing her down held firm, and then, without warning, without justification, the cold metal touched her scalp. A single twist of her hair fell, then another, and another. She sat frozen, jaw clenched, eyes forward, refusing to give them the sound of her pain. But inside, something detonated. Not just rage, not just humiliation. It was the realization that this wasn't about security. It was about control, power, the kind that strips dignity one strand at a time. The laughter came next. One of them chuckled. "Looks better already," he said. Pike nodded, brushing her silver curls from his sleeve like lint. "Now you look more presentable." Her fists clenched so hard, her knuckles whitened. But still, she didn't yell, didn't cry. Her voice was ice when it finally returned. "You'll regret this." Pike leaned in, smirking. "People like you always say that." Then he opened the door and let her go. Just like that. Hair in ruins, heart pounding. But her spine, still straight, her eyes, still sharp. She took her badge back without asking, walked into that hallway without looking back, and with every step, one truth echoed louder in her chest. What they had just done wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning. The hallway outside the courtroom stretched ahead of her like a gauntlet, long, polished, silent. Her steps echoed against marble floors, slow and deliberate, as if each footfall was a refusal to break. Around her, clerks, interns, and lawyers bustled in practiced routine. But when their eyes landed on her unevenly shorn scalp, on the faint red lines where silver coils had once grown thick and proud, they quickly looked away. No one asked questions, no one offered help, just quick glances, averted eyes, and the cold calculation of people who didn't want to get involved. They had seen enough to know something had happened. But not enough, they thought, to say anything, and that was always the excuse, wasn't it? Just enough doubt to justify silence. Celeste Monroe moved through that corridor with a calm that had taken years to master, but under the surface, fury roared like a rising tide. She passed two paralegals who muttered and stepped aside, the quiet shift of their bodies saying what their mouths never would. "We know, but we won't say." Her breath came steady even, but her thoughts were relentless, every clipped curl still fresh in her mind. Every second in that back room carved into her skin like an unwanted brand. But she wasn't going to flinch. Not now. Not when she was this close. Down the hallway, the double doors to the courtroom loomed. Inside was today's docket, an evidentiary hearing in a case that had drawn national attention. Police misconduct, excessive force, civil rights violations, the kind of case she had fought for her entire career. The irony wasn't lost on her. The judge meant to preside over that hearing, the one everyone was waiting for, had just been violated by the very system the case was about. And none of them knew. Not yet. Traditionally, she would have entered through the judge's private chambers. Her robe was waiting there, neatly pressed. Her staff prepped everything. Nameplates, water glass, docket printouts, all the little things meant to maintain order and formality. But that morning, order had been shattered, and the time for formality was over. She didn't go through the back. She didn't slip in quietly. She walked straight to the front doors of the courtroom, paused for one breath, and pushed them open. The silence hit instantly. Conversations stopped mid-word. Heads turned, double takes multiplied. Every eye tracked her from the door to the bench. There she was, no hat, no wig, no attempt to cover the damage. Her shaved scalp caught the light, uneven patches catching attention like bruises that hadn't yet faded. For a second, no one knew what to make of her. Some didn't even recognize her. Others began to piece it together, confusion turning into disbelief. She walked slowly past rows of attorneys and officials who'd seen her name on dockets for years but had never seen her like this. And the deeper she walked into that room, the more the truth began to click. At the far end of the courtroom, behind the polished mahogany bench, her chair stood empty, waiting, as if it had been holding its breath. She reached it without a word. Behind her, the man who had held the clippers, Deputy Pike, stood rigid by the side entrance, his jaw slack, his face pale. When she made eye contact with him, he froze, literally froze. His lips parted like he was going to speak, like maybe the horror of recognition had finally hit. But nothing came out. Not an apology, not an explanation, just silence. And she gave him nothing back. No words, no glare, just distance. She turned to the arm of her chair where her robe lay folded, black, clean, heavy with meaning. One piece of fabric, but centuries of weight. She didn't call for help. She didn't wait for ceremony. She picked it up herself and slid it on one arm at a time. The courtroom watched, transfixed, as she transformed. Not because the robe made her someone new, but because it revealed who she already was. With it draped across her shoulders, she took her seat and asked the clerk in a level voice, "Is the docket ready?" The clerk, visibly shaken, stammered, "Yes, Your Honor." And with that, Celeste nodded. "Then let's begin." The first case on the docket, United States versus Chicago Metropolitan Police Department. Charges: abuse of power, misconduct, and violation of civil rights during a peaceful protest. The room seemed to stiffen at the very mention of the case. Several officers from the protest were present, seated at the defense table, flanked by lawyers who now looked visibly unsure of themselves. And while they squirmed in discomfort, Judge Monroe sat motionless. Her presence alone shifted the atmosphere. There was no longer any doubt about who held the authority in that room. The gavel hadn't just called court into session, it had changed the air entirely. When the first witness was called, a protester injured in last year's demonstration, the room listened with an intensity it had never known. Monroe didn't interrupt, didn't comment. She listened, absorbed, calculated, and from the corner of her eye, she could see Pike trying to inch toward the back of the courtroom, trying to disappear. It wasn't working. His presence was too loud now, his guilt too obvious. Everyone could feel it, even if they didn't know what he'd done yet. As the testimony closed, Monroe called for a brief recess. The courtroom slowly emptied, chatter buzzing like static in the air. But she didn't move. She remained seated, still and silent, her eyes fixed not on the case, but on the man still trying to slink away unnoticed. "Deputy Pike," she said. Her voice sliced through the noise like glass. He stopped mid-step, stunned. "Step forward." You could feel the temperature drop. The room hadn't known what happened earlier that morning, but they were about to. He didn't move at first, not because he didn't hear her, but because his body simply wouldn't obey. Like some part of him, the part that had always assumed he was untouchable, refused to believe this was real. That someone like her, someone he had dismissed as beneath his notice just hours ago, now sat behind the bench with the authority to decide his fate. "Deputy Pike," she repeated, this time slower, sharper. It wasn't a question, it was a command, and finally, stiff-legged, eyes darting for some kind of escape that didn't exist, he stepped forward into the center of the courtroom like a man walking toward the edge of a cliff. He tried to compose himself, tried to fall back on the voice, the tone, the posture that had always worked when he wanted to sound official, credible, in control. But it wasn't working now, not with the gallery watching, not with the attorneys silent, and certainly not with Judge Celeste Monroe staring straight through him like she was peeling back every layer of denial he'd ever worn. "State your full name for the record," she said. He blinked. "Excuse me?" She didn't flinch. "Your name, for the record." His voice cracked slightly. Gerald Pike. "And how long have you served as a deputy in this courthouse?" He hesitated, glancing around. 14 years. She tapped a pen against the pad on her bench once, twice, 3 times, each tap deliberate, each pause heavier than the last. Then she leaned forward. "And in those 14 years, how many women have you physically handled during secondary screenings?" His face twitched. I don't know." "Wrong answer," she said, her voice still even but wrapped in steel. "The correct answer is 12. 12 formal complaints filed against you over the course of your career. 12 women, 12 names, all of them telling stories about the same things: unwarranted contact, verbal harassment, retaliatory searches, and all 12 complaints dismissed." His throat moved, but no words came out. Celeste didn't give him time to recover. "Do you know who signed off on those dismissals?" He shook his head slightly. "No, Your Honor." "I do," she said. "I've seen the signatures." Her words hung in the air like smoke. "And do you know why I'm sitting here, Gerald?" His eyes lifted, searching hers for mercy. "Because I didn't know who you were," he said. "If I had known—" "That's the problem," she interrupted. "You didn't know. You didn't ask. You just saw a black woman walking into a place you thought belonged to you, and you decided she didn't belong." Her tone was colder now, but not raised, never raised. That was her control, her blade. "You stripped me of my dignity not because of something I did, but because of something you assumed, because of something you believed about people like me." The courtroom was silent. The walls seemed to lean in. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. "Because of your actions," she continued, "this courthouse is no longer a sanctuary for justice. It's a scene of a crime. And because I'm the one you laid hands on, because I'm a federal judge, you are now the subject of a criminal investigation, effective immediately." She turned to the two officers still stationed by the rear doors. "Escort Deputy Pike into custody, separate from general population, formal charges to follow." And just like that, the power he'd clung to for years evaporated in real time. The badge that once gave him dominion was removed. The man who had used fear to control, humiliation to dominate, was now handcuffed by the very system he thought he ruled. As they led him away, he turned to speak, maybe to apologize, maybe to justify. But she didn't look at him, not even once. Because justice wasn't about giving him the last word, it was about giving voice to everyone he'd silenced. But the reckoning wasn't over. That afternoon she returned to her chambers and found a folder on her desk. No note, no explanation. Just thick manila marked confidential. Inside were complaint files, internal memos, HR emails, 12 official reports spanning 15 years, each one detailing incidents nearly identical to her own. Same room, same excuses, same man. Every single case had been quietly closed, marked unsubstantiated or resolved. But it wasn't the paperwork that stopped her breath. It was the signatures at the bottom. Judge Terence Mahoney, her mentor, her advocate, the man who had once looked her in the eye and said, "You belong on that bench." And here he was, his name on every denial, every cover-up, every lie. At the very back of the folder, one memo stood out. A note from Mahoney to the head of courthouse security, written 5 years ago. It read, "Pike may be rough around the edges, but he keeps order, especially with certain groups. Best to leave well enough alone." There it was, the quiet part, finally said out loud. This wasn't about one man abusing power. This was about a structure built to protect him, a structure that had treated accountability like a threat and silence like policy, a structure that had survived by convincing people like her to be grateful for the seat at the table, even while the table was built on their backs. She closed the folder, slowly, deliberately. Then she stood and walked to the mirror in her private chambers. Her reflection stared back, uneven scalp, raw patches, eyes red from too little rest and too much clarity. For the first time, she didn't flinch at the image. She studied it, not with shame, but with resolve, because this wasn't just her fight anymore. It never had been. It was about every complaint that had been ignored, every voice that had been buried, every person who had been told to sit down, be quiet, and let the system work as intended. And now that the truth had surfaced, there was no going back. Not for her, not for the court, not for anyone. She didn't sleep that night. Not really. The courthouse had long emptied, the lights in her chambers dimmed, but her mind kept turning. Every complaint in that folder echoed like footsteps behind her, every signature a reminder of the rot buried deep beneath the marble floors. But she didn't feel defeated. She felt sharpened, refined by fire. The injustice wasn't abstract anymore. It had a face, a name, a pattern, and a paper trail that led straight into the offices of people who had sworn to protect the law, but chose instead to protect each other. That morning, she returned to the courtroom with a decision that had already been made in her bones. She wasn't just going to preside, she was going to correct. As she took her seat behind the bench, she announced something no one expected. She wasn't ruling on the next motion. She wasn't calling the next witness. She was introducing a policy, one that would reshape the foundation of every federal building in her district. She called it the Monroe Mandate. She spoke clearly, without pause, without apology. From that day forward, every courthouse official, bailiff, marshal, clerk, deputy, would undergo mandatory anti-bias training, psychological screening, and ongoing behavior assessments. No more hiding behind tenure. No more brushing aside complaints as misunderstandings. A zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory conduct was now the standard, not a suggestion, not a guideline, policy. And she wasn't stopping there. The mandate would go to the circuit, then to Congress. She vowed to drag it up every stair of power until it became law, not just in her courtroom, but across the entire country. The silence that followed wasn't disbelief. It was realization. The kind of quiet that settles in when people know, deep in their gut, that something permanent just happened. The attorneys shifted. Reporters scribbled like mad. Court officers glanced at each other, suddenly aware of the weight of their own conduct. And still, she didn't look around for approval. She didn't check to see if anyone was with her. She had walked alone before. She would do it again if she had to, but she didn't have to for long. Word spread like wind through dry grass. By the afternoon, the courthouse was surrounded, not by chaos, not by violence, but by people. Protesters, yes, but also teachers, clergy, parents, students, former defendants, survivors of silence. A steady stream of citizens stood outside, holding handmade signs, many of them etched with messages that didn't just call out the system, but praised what she was building in its place. Justice starts here. Protect black women. 12 complaints. 0 accountability. Some people held candles, others just held space. But the one thing they all shared was the certainty that this time someone was finally listening. Inside, she prepared for the next session, but before she could return to the bench, a soft knock came at her office door. It was her clerk, but behind her stood someone she hadn't seen in nearly a decade, Reverend Marcus Hill. His beard had gone almost entirely grey, and his suit looked worn at the seams, but his eyes were the same, clear, steady, and full of conviction. He didn't waste time. "We're out there," he said, voice low and unshaken. "We see what you're doing, and we're with you." He reached into his coat and handed her a folded piece of paper. "These are names, victims of Pike, victims of others like him. Most were never given a chance to speak. Some filed complaints that vanished. Some were warned to stay quiet. But they're ready now. If you want them, they're ready." She unfolded the list. Dozens of names, handwritten. Alongside each one was a note, grabbed during security screening, verbally harassed in courtroom hallway, witnessed illegal detainment. Every line told a story, some recent, some over a decade old. She read them all, and when she finished, she looked up and said simply, "They were wrong. It is worth it now." The Reverend gave her a slow, knowing smile. "It's worth it because of you." Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The gallery had doubled. People stood along the back wall, crowding in to witness what was no longer just a case. It was a reckoning. The court rose when she entered, but not out of obligation. This time, it was out of respect, out of something deeper, something earned. When the next witness was sworn in, no one expected who it would be. A middle-aged black woman, dressed sharply in a blazer and glasses, stepped up and gave her name, Denise Talley. Until recently, she had worked as the courthouse's record supervisor. For years, she had been responsible for filing complaints, logging internal reports, and managing the paper trail no one ever thought would be read aloud in open court. But now, she was ready to speak. The prosecutor asked her to explain her role. Denise did calmly. She had overseen complaint intake. She had seen every file, every signature, every red flag. Then came the question that changed everything. "Did you ever handle complaints about Deputy Pike?" Her face didn't flinch. "Yes, too many to count." "Can you estimate?" 12 formal, at least twice that many informal. "And what happened to them?" She paused, looked directly at Celeste, then spoke with deliberate clarity. "They were mishandled. Some were marked resolved when they weren't. Some disappeared. Entirely." A low murmur rolled through the courtroom. "Who gave those instructions?" The pause that followed was longer, heavier. Then she said it. "Judge Terence Mahoney." The room went still. Mahoney, the respected, the retired, the man who'd once been considered a pillar of integrity, Celeste's former mentor, the man who had opened doors for her, and now stood exposed as someone who had closed those same doors for others. He told me bringing those complaints forward would erode trust in the court, Denise said, that it would make us look weak. So we were told to make it disappear, not fix it, not investigate, just bury it. Celeste didn't blink, because that phrase, make us look weak, wasn't new. She'd heard it before, had it used on her, had it etched into every moment she'd been told to stay quiet, stay calm, play the part. And now here it was, laid bare for everyone to see, not as caution, but as corruption. Denise's voice grew stronger as she went on. I watched men like Pike walk these halls with impunity. I watched young black interns be stopped, searched, questioned, while their white peers walked by unbothered. I watched complaints pile up, and I watched the institution protect itself instead of the people inside it. Her voice cracked. Well, not anymore. There were no cheers, no applause, just silence. The kind that speaks louder than noise. The kind that says, we see you, we believe you, we are done pretending. And in that moment, the courtroom stopped being a place of formality. It became a place of truth. Celeste didn't call for order. She didn't need to. The room was listening now, not just with ears, but with hearts. As she stood to call recess, one of the young reporters sitting in the front whispered to no one in particular, she's not just running this courtroom, she's rewriting it. And he was right, because this wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a demolition of silence, a rebuilding of justice from the inside out, and it was far from over. By mid-morning the next day, the steps of the courthouse were no longer just stone. They were a gathering place, a battleground, a sanctuary. The crowd had doubled overnight. What had started with a handful of supporters had grown into something undeniable. There were students holding handmade signs, veterans in wheelchairs, mothers holding toddlers on their hips, ministers in robes, and attorneys in tailored suits, standing shoulder to shoulder with activists in hoodies and sneakers. They came from every direction, Chicago neighborhoods, neighboring counties, and even other states, drawn not by spectacle, but by something stronger, the certainty that a line had finally been drawn in the sand, that someone inside the system had chosen to stop pretending it wasn't broken. Inside, Celeste stood at the window of her chambers, looking down at the growing sea of faces. Some held signs with her name, others just stood, hands in pockets, eyes forward, watching. There was no violence, no shouting, just stillness, purpose. People were waiting, not for justice to be served, because that was already happening, but to witness it, to know it was real. The knock on her door was soft but urgent. Her clerk entered, holding a thick red file and a look that said everything before she spoke. Your Honor, she said, almost whispering, we've just received confirmation. Several new witnesses have come forward, and the Senate Judiciary Committee is asking for your statement. Celeste didn't flinch. What else? The clerk hesitated. 3 former judges and a retired district attorney have resigned this morning, all of them tied to past complaints about Riker, citing health reasons, but we know why. Celeste nodded, the weight of truth settling deeper into her chest. Bring in the attorneys, all of them. We finish this today. The courtroom had never been this full. Reporters from national outlets lined the walls, civil rights lawyers filled the benches, law students sat on the floor, scribbling notes with wide eyes. For once there were more black and brown faces in the gallery than white ones, and they weren't just observing, they were claiming space. In the front row, an elderly woman with a cane sat between 2 young activists, her hand resting gently on her chest like she could feel history happening in real time. When Celeste entered, the entire room rose before the clerk could say a word. She didn't acknowledge the reverence. She didn't need to. She walked with the same grace she had always carried, but now it filled the space completely. She didn't wear a crown, but everyone saw one. She tapped the gavel. Before we proceed with closing arguments, she began, this court will enter into the record new material received by my office this morning. She motioned to her clerk, who handed thick files to both sides of the courtroom. This includes every complaint ever filed against Deputy Riker, every internal memo, every email chain, every signature tied to their suppression. The defense attorney rose to object, but she didn't even look up. "Sit down," she said softly, but the words dropped like stone, final, irrefutable. She turned to the gallery. "Let the record show that this court is no longer interested in preserving institutions at the expense of individuals. We are no longer pretending that silence is neutrality. Every signature in that folder represents a choice, not a mistake. A choice to ignore, to excuse, to cover up." She swept her eyes across the courtroom. "And it ends today." From the back of the room, a hand lifted hesitantly. An older black man stood, voice trembling but resolute. "Your Honor, may I speak?" She gave him a nod. He stepped forward, hat in hand, pain in his eyes. "My name is Louis Bryant. In 2011, I was arrested right here, in this building. Riker slammed me into a wall for raising my voice when my daughter's case got dismissed. Broke 2 ribs. I filed a complaint. They told me I fell." The courtroom fell utterly silent. He looked around. "I never came back, but I'm here now." Then something no one expected happened. One by one, hands began to rise. A woman in her 50s, a young man in a hoodie, a teacher, a retired nurse. People began standing, speaking. "He grabbed me in that screening room. He made me strip in front of another officer. He called me a slur and laughed. I was 16. Story after story poured into the room like water breaking through a cracked dam. They weren't on the witness list. They weren't called by the prosecution. But they came anyway, and they told the truth. Celeste didn't move. She didn't need to guide the moment. This was what justice looked like. Not order, not silence, but truth, finally and unapologetically spoken out loud. When she finally stood, the courtroom quieted again. "Thank you," she said, "every one of you." She paused, then continued. "This court finds Deputy Gerald Riker guilty on all counts: abuse of power, civil rights violations, obstruction of justice. Effective immediately, he is sentenced to the maximum allowable under federal law. But this doesn't end with him." She reached under the bench and lifted another file. "This is a formal recommendation to the Department of Justice. Every official who buried those complaints, every judge who turned a blind eye, every prosecutor who looked away, you are now under review. Consider yourselves on notice." Then she stepped back, unfastened her robe, folded it, laid it gently across the bench, and stood bare, just herself. No titles, no barriers, just a black woman still standing. She spoke one last time. "The Monroe Mandate is now in effect, and I will carry it to the highest courts, the halls of Congress, the doorstep of the White House if I have to, because this isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility. We cannot fix what we refuse to name, and we will never heal what we keep hiding. What happened to me should never have happened to anyone, and I'll make damn sure it never happens again." The court did not erupt. It didn't need to. The silence that followed was deeper than applause. It was reverence, the kind that stays with you long after the room is empty. That night, Celeste left the courthouse with her head bare. No hat, no scarf, no shame. Just her scalp, smooth and even, reflecting the streetlights like armor. People saw her. They didn't whisper. They nodded. An older woman stopped her, tears in her eyes. "I never thought I'd live to see it," she said. Celeste touched her hand gently. "You didn't just see it," she said. "You made it possible." A teenage girl behind them quietly pulled off her hoodie to reveal her own shaved head. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Celeste nodded, and in that exchange something passed between them, a silent inheritance, the beginning of something new, because racism does not die in silence. It doesn't vanish with time. It hides, it waits, it adapts, and it survives in systems that depend on the rest of us pretending not to see. But something changes when one person stops pretending, when one voice refuses to stay quiet, when one act of courage reminds the world that justice is not a building or a title, it's a choice. And that choice, when made by enough of us, is what finally turns a moment into a movement.